I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 18, Black and Blue. We last left off with the death of Emperor Zeno. His reign had been saturated with internal strife, largely due to his weak political situation. Zeno's Isaurian heritage brought him more problems than anything else during his time as the ruler of the Byzantine Empire, and even though he proved to be an effective and relatively just ruler, by the time he died, the people of Constantinople and the wider empire were still opposed to this so-called foreign influence within the military and imperial court. But there was more weighing on the minds of the people of Constantinople than the ethnicity of their ruler. The split between Monophysites and Orthodox Christians had been widening since the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and Zeno's ill-conceived attempt to reach a consensus with both sides proved not only ineffectual, but also ruptured the relationship between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople. In 484, while Acacius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, was conducting a service in Hagia Sophia, someone came up behind him and pinned a letter to his cope. Acacius later discovered that this letter proclaimed that the Pope had excommunicated him, and he responded in kind, meaning that now the imperial capital and the most important Christian city in the West did not recognize each other as even being part of the same religion. Zeno failed to reconcile the two churches before he passed away in 491 at the age of 65, and so there were three major problems facing the empire at the time of his death. One was that, just like his predecessors, Zeno had no son to pass the imperial crown to. In fact, dating back nearly a century to Theodosius II, no emperor had been succeeded by his natural-born son. In some ways, this was a blessing, as it allowed for a more meritocratic recruitment of the most powerful man in the empire. If you remember, the Theodosian dynasty was dominated by wives, sisters, and mothers of the male emperors who were either too weak or too disinterested to effectively rule from Constantinople. After the Theodosian dynasty ended with Marcian, the empire was ruled by fairly strong-willed and capable men who had helped to avoid the disasters that had befallen its sister empire in the west. So it fell to the Senate and the imperial family to choose who the next emperor would be, and their choice would have to deal with the other two major problems facing the empire. He would have to quell the population's anger about both the Isaurians and the split in the church. The most obvious choice, bloodline-wise, was Zeno's brother, Longinus. He had been held hostage by Ilus since Basiliscus's revolt, but when Ilus was defeated and executed, he was set free. Longinus enjoyed a successful military career and spent a large portion of his wealth on trying to bribe the people of Constantinople into liking him, despite his Isaurian heritage. In particular, he bought lavish gifts for the blue and green circus factions that will play a larger role later in this episode. His generosity towards the capital worked relatively well, and in the matter of who should be Zeno's successor, he held the support of the Senate and the powerful circus factions. However, choosing Longinus to be the next emperor would not solve either of the major issues, and so the Dowager Empress Ariadne looked for another candidate. She finally settled on an elderly statesman by the name of Anastasius Dichoras. The title Dichoras came from the physical trait that distinguished Anastasius from any other emperor. He had heterochromia, meaning that the pupils of his eyes were two different colors, one blue and one black, and the word Dichoras in Greek means two-pupiled. Apart from his unique eyes, Anastasius was not very noteworthy prior to his ascension to the imperial throne. He had a reputation for frugality and a dull social life that meant he was respected, but not beloved. He did, however, offer an opportunity to resolve the Isaurian and religious issues. He was born into a Roman family that followed Orthodox Christianity, but had converted to Monophysitism as an adult. He was obliged to sign a declaration saying that he would not repudiate the decrees of the Council of Chalcedon before the Patriarch of Constantinople would coronate him, and thus the issues were on their way to being resolved. Constantinople was now ruled by, in the eyes of the people, a true citizen who, despite the fact that he was a Monophysite, had promised to protect the Orthodox faith. This meant that the Romans, the Orthodox Christians, and the Monophysite Christians all had a stake in the success of Anastasius. There were two groups who were not as happy to see Longinus passed over in favor of this boring Roman bureaucrat. These were the Isaurians, who still held prominent positions within the military, and the circus factions that had greatly enjoyed Longinus's patronage. Despite the protests from these groups in the spring of 491, Anastasius was crowned emperor in Hagia Sophia and later married the widow Ariadne, who had been the principal supporter of the new emperor. It was never speculated that Anastasius had a previous romantic relationship with the wife of the last emperor, so we can assume that this marriage to her was simply a matter of political convenience, rather than the result of a steamy affair. It is quite possible that many people thought that the reign of Anastasius would be short and uneventful due to his advanced age. At the time of his coronation, he was 61 years old, so we can hardly blame the people for thinking he lacked the energy or the time to truly shape the destiny of Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire. But to everyone's surprise, Anastasius kicked off a reign that would eventually last 27 years with a series of radical economic and administrative reforms. By the time his reign began, the economic boom that had accompanied Marcian's reforms in the early 450s had gradually slowed until the empire was once again facing a serious lack of funds during Zeno's reign. Anastasius was true to his reputation of stinginess, as he slashed unnecessary government expenses and cut taxes for the poor to stimulate the economy. The common people rejoiced at having more of their wages stay in their pockets, but the other side of Anastasius's frugality made them grumble. The new emperor had no time for frivolity in government or in social life. Accompanying the tax remissions was a slate of reforms that sought to curb immoral behavior in Constantinople. The imperial city had gained a reputation for debauchery and hedonism that did not sit well with their new sovereign, and so Anastasius banned circuses that included wild beasts and parties that took place after the setting of the sun. In his mind, these events were a negative influence on the character of the people of the capital. So while the citizens of Constantinople were happy to be richer, they were upset that all the things they had previously enjoyed spending their money on were now apparently unfashionable. For the course of Anastasius' reign, the wealth of Constantinople rapidly expanded, yet the city seemed to glean less and less. You have to wonder whether this approach of cutting spending and taxes was really working, since it did nothing to stop the cyclical boom and bust of the Byzantine economy. While fiscal policy can certainly tip the needle back and forth, perhaps it was just an innate characteristic of the mode of production that the empire possessed. Unfortunately, there weren't really many economic scholars back in the day, so Anastasius was limited to doing what he believed had previously been done to raise the imperial cash reserves, and, as is often the case in history, the true effects of this growth and wealth would not be seen until after Anastasius' time. He was planting trees under whose shade he would never sit. Moving on from talk of Anastasius' economic policy, we must now address the imminent conflict between the Isaurians and the rest of the Byzantine population. Ariadne had hoped by selecting a Roman emperor that she could calm down the agitated population of Constantinople and avoid any more bloodshed. What really happened was that, while the Greeks and Romans were placated, the Isaurians now believed that their position within the empire was under threat. Furthermore, the passing over of Zeno's brother Longinus gave the Isaurians a singular figure in which to rally around and express their grievances. During the first year of Anastasius' reign, Constantinople was rocked by street riots that led to fires that burned down many prominent buildings. Sources disagree on who was the instigator of these riots, with some claiming they were anti-Isaurian riots started by the Greeks and Romans, and others claiming that Longinus and the Isaurians started them in response to Anastasius' religious views. Whoever started them didn't matter, as it was now clear that the capital could no longer host both Isaurians and the anti-Isaurians without risking them tearing each other apart. In 492, Anastasius made the decision to exile Longinus and the other Isaurians from Constantinople. This may seem like a harsh measure, but keep in mind that after Basiliscus had ousted Zeno, the Isaurians living in the capital were massacred by an angry mob. Exile was probably the safest thing for the Isaurians, in addition to relieving Anastasius of one of his headaches. But Longinus and his followers did not see it this way. They had been rejected by the empire they had served for centuries, once too often, and so, from their exile, they rallied their people and began the Isaurian War. This civil war could also be called the Johns versus the Longinuses, as the Byzantines were led by 2 men named John, and the Isaurians were led by 3 men named Longinus. The war was a thoroughly one-sided affair that would have been over within the year if it wasn't for the Isaurians' one advantage. We have seen time and time again, whenever the Isaurians' backs are against the wall, they fall back into the mountains of Inner Anatolia, and so after the first battle of the Isaurian War resulted in a resounding Byzantine victory, the Isaurians, now down 1 Longinus, fled to their homeland to hold up in their nearly impenetrable fortresses. This stalemate would last until 497, when the Isaurian leaders were finally either killed or captured. During this time, the quote-unquote war constituted nothing more than a minor annoyance of Anastasius, and it seemed like the Isaurian problem had finally been resolved. Despite how anticlimactic the final showdown between the Isaurians and the Byzantines was, it did provide an interesting opportunity for Anastasius. During the war, the emperor was able to implicate the Patriarch of Constantinople in a conspiracy to provide state secrets to the Isaurians. Anastasius had never forgiven Patriarch Euphemius for forcing him to sign the Declaration of Orthodoxy, and was constantly looking to replace him with a monophysite bishop. So in 496, when the trumped-up charges were levied against Euphemius, he had no choice but to accept excommunication and exile. Anastasius's continued turn towards monophysitism further widened the schism between Rome and Constantinople, though that was not his intention. In reality, Anastasius sought to reconcile the two churches, but he was unwilling to compromise his beliefs for this to happen. The Isaurian War was the only major military conflict of Anastasius's first decade on the throne, but as the turn of the century came and the emperor entered his 70s, an old enemy would once again threaten the empire. Since the days of Theodosius the Great, the eastern rival of the Roman Empire, the great Sassanid Persian Empire, had been dormant. The peace agreement signed by Shapur III and Theodosius in 384 had continued nearly uninterrupted for over a century. During this time, both the Romans and the Persians were preoccupied with barbarian invasions on opposite fronts. Though relations could never truly normalize between the two great powers, they had seemed to have settled into a mutually beneficial arrangement that prevented the massive wars that had been periodically fought since 54 BC. It all came crashing down in the year 502, when the Persian king needed vast sums of money to pay the debts he owed to the people who had helped him take the throne. King Kavad I reached out diplomatically to Anastasius to loan him the money, but as we already know, the Byzantine emperor was not open to risky financial deals, and so he refused. Kavad saw no other choice than to seize the wealth of the Byzantines by force, so he ordered his armies to capture several cities on the eastern border of the Byzantine Empire. Anastasius was caught completely off guard. For the last century or so, the rulers of Constantinople had hardly ever turned their gaze that far east, and most of the border defenses had been focused in the Danube and Balkan regions in the west. This renewed threat in the east would completely reorient Constantinople and its empire, not only for the immediate conflict, but also leading into the distant future. The first year or so of the war saw no major battles, as the surprise Persian invasion caught all the small Byzantine border garrisons with their pants down. The populations of the cities that were overrun by the Persians were deported deeper into the Sassanid Empire. The Persians believed that it would be easier to hold the border if their strongholds weren't filled with conquered people eager to rebel against their new oppressors, and so the towns were repopulated with loyal Persian citizens. By the year 503, the Persians had yet to see a significant number of Byzantine troops, but that was about to change. In the spring of that year, an army, 52,000 strong, left Constantinople and marched east with the mandate of retaking the border fortresses and pushing the Persians back into their country. This army was the largest the empire had sent into the east since Julian the Apostate's attempted invasion of Persia back in 363. Anastasius had no intention of following in his predecessor's footsteps, seeing how this invasion led to Julian getting a spear in the gut. So the Byzantine army was led by a diverse group of commanders, while Anastasius stayed safe in Constantinople. Among the officers leading the counterattack was a young man who had previously been a member of the palace guard. His name was Justin, and he will play a significant role later in our story. For now, Justin was about to be thrown into a military campaign that was marked by strategic missteps from both sides. The first error came from the Byzantines when they underestimated the strength of their opponents. Because of this, they decided to split their force into 3 divisions. The first 2 went to retake the strongest fort in the region, Amida, while the other one went to attack the city where the Persian king was overseeing the entire war. Unlike Anastasius and the Byzantine Empire, Kavad and the Persian Empire did not put so much stock in their capital. In their eyes, the heart of the empire was wherever the king was, so he was able to move closer to the front lines and take a much more active leadership role. The single division sent to threaten the Persian king was almost able to overcome the Persian defenses, but a swift counterattack forced the Byzantines to retreat past their initial fallback point and into the western portion of Anatolia. As they retreated, they sent word to the rest of the army, begging for assistance. The other 2 divisions tried to meet up with them, but they were cut off and defeated by a large Persian force. Now that the Byzantine strategic blunder was complete, it was time for the Persians to make theirs. Rather than split his forces like the Byzantines, Kavad focused his efforts first on the city of Constantia, and then Edessa. What he failed to account for was that there was still an enemy division in play, and that Edessa was much deeper within enemy territory than the border towns that had previously capitulated easily. The defenses of Constantia managed to prevent Kavad from taking the city and slowed him down, but he still pushed his army further, towards Edessa. The delay allowed for the Byzantine division that had previously retreated westward to loop back around and take the fortress city of Amida. This is where the overextension of the Persians really came into play, as now their supply lines were cut off and the Byzantine reinforcements were approaching from the west. On top of all of this, the Huns were invading the Sassanid Empire from the north. Kavad was able to extract his army from this terrible situation, but it was clear now that the Byzantines had all the initiative. The remainder of the campaign saw Byzantine forces retake the border cities they had lost, but they were unable to push into Persian territory. By the time 504 rolled around, both sides were exhausted from the fighting, and peace negotiations began. It took 2 years to finally reach an agreement, but in 506 the war officially ended, with no change in territory and a small, single-time payment made to the Persians. When looking at a map of the 2 empires made at the turn of the century, and one made 6 years later at the end of the war, you couldn't possibly tell that anything important had happened in those intervening years. But the war had fundamentally shifted the focus of the Byzantine Empire. Suddenly, money that had previously been spent building beautiful churches, colossal walls, and important infrastructure in Constantinople was now being spent on building new fortifications on the far eastern front. Additionally, the armies that had, for over 100 years, protected the capital from Germanic and Hunnic invasions were reassigned to watch the Persian border. With Constantinople now significantly more vulnerable, as was shown by recent invasions of Slavs and Bulgars, Anastasius was forced to spend some of the money he preferred to save on a new series of fortifications called the Anastasian Wall. This wall was built a few miles away from Constantinople, and it stretched from the Black Sea to the Marmara Sea. This effectively cut Constantinople off from the rest of the province of Thrace. It wasn't nearly as effective as the Theodosian walls, as it was too long to man properly and was built so fast that it lacked structural integrity. Still, it made the people in the capital feel safer, even though they really weren't. The end of the war with the Persians was the last time Anastasius would have to deal with large-scale military matters, but that did not mean that there wasn't a tremendous amount of violence still left to witness. Instead of taking place out on the frontier, this violence would be mostly localized in Constantinople and the province it was located in. The principal agitators of said violence would be the group other than the Isaurians who disliked the choice of Anastasius as emperor. These were the politically influential and often riotous blue and green circus factions. I first mentioned these factions when I talked about the tremendous transformation Constantinople underwent when Constantine chose it to be the new imperial capital. One of his most important contributions to the city was a new hippodrome that would host chariot races and other entertaining events for all classes of citizens in Constantinople. Back in Constantine's days, there were 4 racing teams: red, green, blue, and white. But the continued dominance of the blue and green factions left the other 2 in the dustbin of history. In the early days of Constantinople, the factions were loosely connected to the government by the rule that factions had to be funded by the emperor and high-ranking officials in his court. A large majority of each faction's supporters were of course the common people, but they held no stake, other than an emotional one, in their team, and so were not ideologically influential over their chosen faction. During this early period of sports in Constantinople, there were a number of riots that were tied to either faction, but these disturbances had no political nature and were just the standard fare of sports fans getting worked up over their team losing. That isn't to say that some of these riots did not cause substantial damage to the capital city, it's just that they weren't motivated by an ideology. Yet. This all changed in the 5th century, when, by imperial decree, the responsibility of choosing the managers of each faction would fall to the government, giving imperial officials direct control over the chariot teams. This created a trickle-down effect, wherein the manager of a faction would likely follow the political leanings of the governmental official who elevated him, and then the team would follow the manager, and the fans would follow the team, until suddenly you had a large portion of the population subscribed to a political ideology that they still had no real control over. The parallel to modern-day political parties is quite disturbing. From the mid-5th century onward, the factions, now just the blues and greens, would become an integral part of choosing the next emperor, showing how in just a few short decades they had gone from part of the entertainment industry to having a hand in picking the most powerful man in the empire. The common people seemed to believe that the factions represented them, and so gave them a voice in government, but in reality they were only populist as far as they needed to be to keep their fans under control. As the reign of Zeno drew to a close, the political character of the circus factions was as follows. The blues were most often associated with the powerful Greco-Roman aristocracy that were the major landowners both in Constantinople and throughout the empire. This is not the origin of the term blue-blooded, in reference to so-called noble blood, but instead just a historical coincidence that the highest class was represented by the blue faction. On the other hand, the greens represented merchants, those who worked in skilled trades, and bureaucrats. This group was not the common people, the day laborers and peasants, but instead a sort of proto-bourgeoisie that held a moderate amount of economic power, but had yet to wield very much political power. As is often the case when 2 factions are paired off in opposition to each other, people began associating traits with each one, and then assumed the other represented the opposing view. For example, many of the constituents of the Green faction came from the Far East provinces, where monophysitism was more entrenched than around Constantinople in the West. Therefore, people began viewing the Greens as all monophysites, and that this was an integral part of their ideology. So logically, the Blues must have represented Orthodox Christianity. Neither faction had intentionally chosen these designations, but as time went on, they grew to embody their assigned roles. When the debate over Zeno's successor was underway, Longinus did a great job at swaying both the Greens and the Blues to his side. It wasn't that hard of a job, as we have already established that Anastasius was a well-known stick in the mud, who hated the factions because they made the populace more rowdy, and because they were a drain on government resources. The animosity between the emperor and the circus factions continued even after the fall of Longinus, and made the relationship between the sovereign of Constantinople and his people strained. The first major outburst came when a group of dissatisfied fans pelted the imperial seat with stones during an exhibition at the Hippodrome. This violence was disturbing to the emperor, but it was nothing compared to what would come later in his reign. As Anastasius's time as emperor continued, the The solidarity between the Greens and the Blues that had formed when they both supported Longinus over Anastasius gradually eroded. This was helped along by the emperor's clear preference towards the Green faction. Though Anastasius disliked chariot racing and all forms of fun, he was a devout monophysite, and so he selected the Greens as the lesser of two evils. It all came to a head in 511, when Anastasius grew dissatisfied with the Patriarch of Constantinople. Mind you, the Patriarch at this time was a well-meaning and considerate man named Macedonius that Anastasius had handpicked to succeed the exiled Euphemius. Perhaps Anastasius believed because Macedonius was so even-tempered that he would capitulate to the emperor's whims without a fight. On the contrary, as the emperor became more and more obsessed with supplanting orthodoxy with the monophysite view he held, he found more and more opposition to his plans from Macedonius. Finally fed up with the Patriarch, Anastasius sent a mob of clergymen and church officials to harass Macedonius at his residence in Hagia Sophia. The emperor then accused Macedonius of planning this disturbance of the peace in order to discredit him. The Blue faction saw this as a direct attack on a defender of Orthodox Christianity by a heretical monophysite emperor. They rallied their supporters to march on the imperial capital, and had Macedonius not hastened to disperse the angry mob, it is quite likely that they would have removed the crown from the emperor's head, or even removed his head from his body. The debacle in 511 had shown the emperor two things. One, that orthodoxy could not be challenged even by someone as powerful as an emperor, and two, that the circus factions now held enough sway over the population of Constantinople that they could even challenge the emperor politically. But Anastasius turned a blind eye to these lessons, and in 512 he had Macedonius quietly deposed and exiled. If he had hoped that this would avoid an outbreak of riots in response, he must have been sorely disappointed, as this time the Blues threw an even bigger fit. For 3 days the capital was in utter chaos as the Blues burned, looted, and in some cases murdered their way through the city in a blind rage. Finally, Anastasius left the security of the imperial palace and met his subjects in the hippodrome. Here, in front of 20,000 bloodthirsty rioters, he offered to resign his position as emperor willingly if the people could agree on who his successor should be. At this point, Anastasius was 81 years old, and it is quite possible that the people felt a little ashamed of getting so angry at such an old man. And was it really worth the hassle of choosing a successor if Anastasius was clearly not long for this world? In the end, the crowd dispersed, and the emperor was allowed to keep his throne, where he would sit for another 6 years. Over the 27-year duration of his reign, Anastasius had dealt with just about every problem an emperor could face. The only one we can definitively say he excelled at was the economy, as he left a surplus of over 320,000 pounds of gold in the imperial treasury. He did manage to put down numerous rebellions and attempted coups, but at great cost in material and manpower. On the religious and foreign fronts, there were several issues left unresolved, but they were too colossal for us to expect any one man to fix them. All that remained for Anastasius was to choose his successor, because just like the last 4 emperors, he had no son to inherit his crown. He did, however, have 3 nephews, any of whom would have been an acceptable choice as successor. Sometimes, being in the position of having too many choices is more frustrating than being in the position of having no choice. As Anastasius grew older and older, and it became more and more apparent that his time was coming, he began obsessing about which nephew would be the chosen one. His choice would determine his legacy, and whoever he picked would inherit enough gold to change history, for better or for worse. It is because of the importance of this decision that the emperor's eventual choice was a shock to absolutely everyone, and required the contemporary historians to concoct an elaborate fiction as to why Anastasius chose who he did. As the story goes, Anastasius had always been a man of faith. Nowadays, we would call him superstitious, but back then he was hardly any more enamored by the mysticism of God than any of his subjects. Anyway, as the choice of successor began stressing him out more and more, the emperor decided to leave the decision up to God. Since God would not give a straightforward answer to Anastasius's prayers, the emperor devised a trick to show him which nephew to choose. He had 3 couches moved into his chambers. Under the cushions of 2 of the couches there was nothing, but under the 3rd he placed a message declaring, "Congratulations, you will be my successor." Anastasius believed that God would guide whichever nephew was meant to be emperor to the right couch, and thus the decision would be made. But apparently God did not want any of Anastasius's nephews to be emperor, because when he invited them to meet with him in his chamber, 2 of them sat on the same couch, and none of them sat on the special couch. Anastasius was frustrated that God had sidestepped his attempt at getting a definitive answer, and decided on a much more simplistic approach. He resolved that whoever walked into his chambers first the next morning would become the next emperor. This man happened to be Justin, commander of the Imperial Guard. Now this story is likely completely made up, just to explain the inexplicable choice of Justin as successor. Of all the emperors during the course of the Roman and Byzantine empires that were plucked from relative obscurity, Justin was by far the most obscure. He was a Thracian peasant who had come to Constantinople with no money, no reputation, and no education, all in search of his destiny. He had managed to get a job with the Executors, a new division of the palace guard, and made his way gradually up the ranks. As a member of the guard, he often represented them outside of Constantinople when able-bodied men were needed for military campaigns. His bravery and loyalty fighting the Isaurians and the Persians led him to break free from his lowly station and become a tribune, a comes or count, and eventually a senator. He came back to serve in the palace guard after Anastasius selected him to be their commander. It was quite likely that as commander of the palace guard, Justin was often the first person that Anastasius saw every day, and so it really wasn't much of a gamble when the emperor decided the first person he saw in the morning would be his successor. Justin's reign was shorter and less turbulent than Anastasius, and he is largely overshadowed by the man that would succeed him. Still, his story is necessary in understanding the whole scope of the history of Constantinople, and so we will cover it in the next episode. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.